You are listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the deluge and deconstructs the news from the continent. My name is Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the show. Some quick housekeeping for those of you who want to get the very latest from theafricareport.com. Please head to the website and sign up for our newsletter. It's free, but we'll also be having another PDF giveaway of some top content, our exclusive ranking of Africa's top 200 banks. Now, this week, a fascinating conversation with Eric Olander, the Managing Editor of the China-Africa Project, a fantastic new resource on the economic, political, diplomatic, you name it, relations between China and the continent. Eric's a journalist who's been looking at the China-Africa relationship for over a decade. He's been based in Africa, Europe, the US, and across Asia. We get into the big Chinese telecoms operators coming into Africa, the possibilities of opening up new trading channels between Africa and China. We talk about the debt issue, the diplomatic payoff that China gets from African votes in big institutions, and much, much more. So, without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Eric Olander. Eric Olander, you're currently in Vietnam?
I'm in Vietnam, yes.
Vietnam, and it is, I imagine, well into the afternoon, evening where you are right now.
It is deep into the afternoon right now, but you would never know it by the temperature outside because it's always about 35 degrees, right, no matter what time of day. But nonetheless, it is a beautiful rainy afternoon here in the rainy season in Saigon.
Oh, fantastic. I wish I could say the same about Paris. It's just the cold rainy season here right now. But Eric, you have a new China-Africa project online now. You've had the podcast going for many years. You've had the initiative with your colleagues in South Africa. Tell us about this new iteration of the China-Africa project.
Yeah, so we started this back in 2010, and that's about the time that I met you, was 2011-12. So you and I go way back at the early days of this, and I was doing this always as a passion project. So from 2010 until this year, it was something that I did while I was editor-in-chief of France 24 or working at Radio France International or at any of the various journalism jobs that I've had in other countries. Finally, I was living in Shanghai, and the opportunity came up to kind of take this on full time, in part because our audience has grown to 1.4, 1.5 million followers now around the world. And you think that's an incredible number of people who are interested in China, Africa, which seems for a lot of people to be rather random or niche. But as you know from your own audience at the Africa Report, if you live in Africa, this is a daily reality. And so we, came about by being kind of neutral, impartial. We don't advocate for any country, culture, company. We don't take any of that kind of money. We do this all because we have a passion for giving good information. So what we've done this year, and just this past week, is launched a brand new suite of services on our website. So we have a new daily email newsletter. We have a new website that features a China-Africa experts network where people can come and meet a lot of the guests that we have. It's great for journalists to connect to sources. It's great for activists, artists to interact with one another with an interest in China, in Africa, in development. We also have a new section called Student Exchange, where we have young people in Africa and also young people in China and around the world commenting on China-Africa issues, in part because we felt that if you're not listening to teenagers in Africa, you're simply not listening to Africa, because the median age there is 19.4 years old. And in some countries, we're looking at 17, 18 years old being the median age. And so when we're only listening to people in their 40s and 50s, we're missing something. So we really wanted to get that voice of youth to come into this discussion. And then we have a news feed and we have exclusive analysis. We're commissioning people all over the world to write about this important topic and to share different ideas on it, because there is no monopoly on the narrative. We really want to kind of get people to go, I didn't think about it. So we're inviting everybody to go check out ChinaAfricaProject.com. At the end of the day, it's just me and my partner, Cobus van Staden from the South African Institute of International Affairs. I work on this full time. He works on it just, again, as a passion project, nights and weekends. So it's really a labor of love, and we'd love to have everybody check it out and tell us what you think of it.
Here. Yeah, I heartily recommend that, ChinaAfricaProject.com. You should all go and check that out. I would like to talk a little bit about the slow change we are seeing in that wider China-Africa meta-narrative. I believe you described it as a decade ago. Just because it's just the basso continuo in the behind of so many conversations about what's happening on the continent at the moment. Obviously, a great deal of attention has been paid to the large state-backed Chinese companies who are involved in oil, minerals of all nature, to some extent agriculture. I think of tobacco in Zimbabwe, although I think that's a commercial company, not a state-backed company. But that has really seized the attention of people over the last decade. Less talked about, but still, very, very interesting has been the myriad of small Chinese companies who are involved, even at a smaller level. I remember we were discussing maybe about 7 or 8 years ago a bulletin board where you could see all written in Mandarin or Cantonese. I'm not sure what.
In Chinese,
in Chinese, we need 4 juicing plants, or we need these small requests for labor or for products. So even bubbling underneath the surface of those big mineral and infrastructure deals, you had a lot of private sector activity. Now what we're seeing is some big companies in China who are focused on the African market in the technology space. That I think was it just yesterday there was the IPO of one of the large telecoms companies.
Yeah, Transsion had its IPO on the Shanghai Star Exchange, which is the tech version of the Shanghai Stock Exchange, much like NASDAQ, went up 64%. And I think that is really indicative of the excitement that a lot of investors in China have about the African market. And this is a private sector company, much like Huawei or Star. Now, again, China, things are never as clean and neat as they are elsewhere. So private sector doesn't necessarily mean entirely private. So a lot of these private companies like Huawei benefit from their relationship with the Chinese government to access capital, government loans that go to countries in Zambia, Nigeria, whatnot, that Huawei or even Techno gets to benefit from. So again, there's not a clean line, but the key message of 2019 is the shift to the private sector. This is the message we heard at TCAD 7 in Yokohama, where the Japanese said they want to back away from state-led development finance. This was the message of Prosper Africa in Maputo earlier this year from the United States. And interestingly enough, when Yang Jiechi, the top diplomat for China, went to Nairobi a couple of weeks ago and met with Uhuru Kenyatta, the message that he brought was private sector, and the message that Kenyatta gave back said, we want more access for Kenyan companies into the China market, and we want Chinese companies to invest more here. So 2019 is really the pivotal year in the switch from state-backed kind of investment to more private sector-led investment. And the Chinese are very, very active in this. You'd be surprised how many venture capital firms are popping up in Shanghai to do investing in Africa. And they're popping up in Nairobi as well. And so you're going to see a lot more in the tech space, but also in agriculture, healthcare, automotive, in a lot of different sectors. The Chinese are coming in with the private sector.
Just stepping back, I guess we've seen how important technology has been in the global economy in the last decade. The sort of post.com economic growth globally, the Amazons, the Googles, Facebooks, WeChats, Alibabas, Apples. I mean, they've all blossomed with the smartphone, with 4G, which has allowed a new generation of companies who can access and use this fast internet to offer things, be it Uber or you name it, the huge ecosystem of companies who are reliant on 4G. Is it fair to say that there are these concerns about I think former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown called it the splinternet, this concern that if the trade war between the US and China continues, if Huawei continues to be blacklisted, and there is a peeling off into two sections, around 5G, with China obviously making the running on that, Africa might find itself in a different infrastructural and technological ecosystem of its own in the decades going forward. And what does that mean in terms of integrating with all the European and American companies?
So there isn't consensus on this issue, and it really depends on who you speak with. The United States and people in Washington will tell you that there is a big risk of splinternet, in part because the U.S. has come out very clearly and said those countries that have Huawei equipment may not be able to interact with the United States, for example, for security concerns. And so, but then you talk to African tech leaders and policymakers, and they'll say, you know what, the world is much bigger than just the United States and China. So let's look at this in the near term and in the long term. The near term, probably no splinternet. You're going to see an infrastructure built on Chinese hardware. Already, most of the 4G network, I think 70% in Africa, was built on a Huawei backend. And then there's a little bit from Europe, but for the most part, it's Huawei. And that comes in part because the technology is good and it's affordable, but also because it comes with state-backed loans and concessional loans, which make it very easy to install that gear. That's not going to change anytime soon. The long term, and this is when you talk to the Chinese, it's fascinating when you talk to Chinese because time is a very different concept for them. I've spoken to a number of different people, both inside the private sector and scholars and other analysts, and they'll say, well, in 50 years, in 100 years. You're like, wait, what? 50 years? They're thinking about a 50-year plan. Now, it's not necessarily a plan that's written down that says in 2065 we're going to do this, but it's just that their time horizon is much longer. So the idea now, what Huawei's trying to do is lay the infrastructure to really establish momentum in building the standards. And what the Chinese want more than anything right now, and this is the 50-year plan, is the idea that, well, the 5G standards they're using, the data, the cloud storage standards they're using, all the artificial intelligence standards that are being formed right now, will be the equivalent of the British pound or the weights, the language. Under the British, English became the standard language. The plugs that people use around the world used to be a British standard. Because Britain was the most powerful country in the world, they got to set the rules for everybody else. And that's what the Chinese are trying to do and what the Americans are trying to do. So this is a fight over standards. And so if we do get into a world where, we've got Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, all of those companies on one side and Facebook, Google, and all those other companies on another side, Africa does stand to be caught in the middle of that. Hard to tell how that will play out, but there is certainly a risk on that. And the last point that I'd like to make on that is on the question of data governance. Right now, Africa is not anywhere near as advanced in data governance as, say, the Europeans are with GDPR or California is in the United States. And it's an issue of what's going to happen to Africans' personal data when Alibaba, when Google, when Facebook come in and just sweep it all up. Who's going to own that? Who's going to control that? Will that be in the hands of the Chinese or be in the hands of the Americans? Kai-Fu Lee, the former head of Microsoft, Google, in China, he did those in different stints. He wrote a book called AI Superpowers, and he clearly spelled out that Africa is standing in the middle in a very, very vulnerable space because its lack of its own assertiveness and agency to push back against the superpowers in Beijing and Washington on that front. So I gave you a very long, convoluted answer simply because this is a very, very complex issue with no definitive answer.
I gave a long, convoluted question, so... So I think it's all square. We have seen, the beginnings of integrations of, commercial spaces between various African countries and China. I noticed just the other day, Flutterwave, which is a Nigeria-based payment system, has struck a deal with Alibaba, the Chinese Amazon, if we're allowed to say that, and.
Much more than just Amazon. the Chinese eBay, Amazon, everything.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a whole commercial ecosystem. I'm going to try not to say ecosystem any more times today, but it is. It is